Morning. It's certainly good to be with you. I say good morning. You can actually watch this whenever you please, so I guess it could be the middle of the night, but at least it is morning for me at the present time. We had thought that perhaps we would be able to go back to our normal activities a little quicker than we may. We had thought that maybe by the 1st of April, we had said that we might begin assembling again, and then we were told that it would be somewhere around the 14th or 15th of April, and now they're saying the 30th, so I'm not exactly sure when. There is one thing about the words of man. They are not fixed. They are easily changed. When it comes to the words of God, of course, God, forever thy word is settled in heaven, O God. So God's word is eternal. It is based upon perfect knowledge, and it is based upon His power. Whereas man's word is based upon an imperfect knowledge and based upon us being very powerless in certain circumstances for the surroundings that we encounter. So we don't really know, but we'll try to notify you on our radio program. And, of course, the members of the congregation, we are able to contact most of them by an email or telephone. Perhaps all of them, at least in one of those two ways. So we'll try to keep you informed as to when we are going to be able to be back in the building assembly. I've talked with several people last week about how they were handling the situation, and they are handling it in different ways. We, of course, are trying just to have a lesson each week that you can be able to tune in and listen to, and we hope that you continue worshiping at home. We do have some folks that I've talked with who've actually set up a parking lot type of service where they have an FM broadcaster, and they do that from the some location that everyone sits in their cars. And I've talked with some folks who actually have a program on the computer where they can have kind of like a conference call, and every member of the congregation can be in on it, and everybody's in their own little separate screen and has the opportunity to speak up and say what they please during a Bible class. So people are handling it in different ways. One of the things that's interesting is I know that we had put some information on the internet before, very limited, but now we, along with a lot of other people, have lessons that we're doing on a regular basis. And if we change that, then we'll let you know when you can expect more of them. But at the present time, we're doing one sermon a week on the internet, and hopefully you're capable of tuning in. We do have about 3 or 4 or 5 people in the congregation who don't have the internet, and consequently they're not able to take part in it. But for the most part, we have had a lot of folks to listen, and probably have even a greater listenership than when we have our assembly, because you can look at the number of people who've listened, and it exceeds the amount normally present in our assembly. So we certainly are thankful for you tuning in if you're someone who's not a member of the congregation here. We're going to talk this morning about a subject that's much on everybody's mind, and it is the subject of fear. When we think about fear, we really need to stop and think about something else first. I think people's fears many times come about because of their understanding, because of their faith, and because of what basically governs them and steers them. For example, I believe that as Genesis chapter 1 verse 28 says, that we're created in the image of God. Therefore, we are both a spiritual as well as a physical creature, as is stated also in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. There is a spiritual body and there is a physical body. And I understand that. So when I think of fear, my fear would be different than a person who believes that they are an animal, that they evolved from lower animal forms, and that when they die, they're going to lose all existence. And so whatever they're going to enjoy and whatever they're going to have as a part of their experience is going to have to be during this short period of time they're here upon this earth. That the Scriptures define to be 70 or 80 years, and experience tells us that's still a pretty good number from the standpoint of an average lifespan. So fear is much different in the life of a person who doesn't believe in God than it would be in the life of a person who does believe in God. When I look around me today, and I look at people who are reacting to our present circumstances, I see a distinct difference between those who don't believe in God and those who do. One is a rather hopeless position, and one is one of a certain degree of confidence. And you wonder, what is the difference? And the difference is basically their belief in God. So I want to think with you a little bit this morning about the subject of fear, and I want to think about what fear is. And fear is, in fact, it is simply an emotion like any other emotion. It is not always based in fact. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. I remember several years ago, in fact many years ago, about 53 years ago, in the spring and summer of 1968, I was at a fire base in Vietnam, and there was a situation where there was a unit that was next to ours that was being transferred to a different location. And during that period of time, in their discussions as to what they were to do in preparation for that, it was brought up by someone that they might lose 75% of their personnel. And so the medic in their unit had the very brilliant idea that he would go back to the supply area and he would get 75% of their personnel in number of body bags, and he'd stack them up on the back of his Jeep, which were clearly labeled, and bring them back. And then the question came up, well, why so many body bags? And someone says, because 75% of us may die. Well, all of a sudden they had a terrible problem. And you can imagine. In fact, I still remember that before they were able to ship them out to their new location, they ended up having the commander of the 101st Airborne. They ended up having more than one chaplain, several meetings to try to dispel their fears and say, well, we're actually preparing for what might be the worst case scenario, and it may not come to pass. And in fact, it didn't. But fear doesn't take facts into account. Fear is something that simply acts based upon what we think is so. And if you don't believe in God, then your perspective of what is so will be very, very different. I was thinking about this. I've sometimes heard people say that that courage is the absence of fear, and I've used this many times in preaching. Well, I'm going to tell you what sometimes I would think the absence of fear would be defined as, and it wouldn't be defined as courage, it would be defined as insanity. For a person to not be fearful of things would be just insane. It would be ridiculous. I think back to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and I think to the time when He was in the garden before His crucifixion, and the words that are used to describe Him is that He began to be sorrowful and very heavy. What is it that caused that sorrow? And what is it that caused that? I suppose that heavy there would be defined as depression or something akin to that. Well, I would say that what was causing that would have been fear. I mean, the fact is that Jesus had told His disciples exactly what was going to happen. He knew. He knew that He'd be arrested. He knew the events of His trial. He knew the crucifixion would occur. And He knew the pain that would be involved in that. And He knew all the things that certainly all of us would dread, and He as well. So, what did He do? Based upon the fact that, in this case, it wasn't just a suspicion of what was going to happen. He knew 100% what was going to happen. Well, what happened was, He comes to His disciples, and He says to them, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even unto death. Tarry ye here and watch with me. He acknowledged that there was a great deal of unsettledness in his life. And then he went and he prayed to God. And what he prayed was, O my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Now, if he was not dreading the next day, was not fearful of all the things that would occur, then why would he have prayed such a prayer? It was obvious that his emotions led him to this type of prayer. But he went on to say in that prayer, nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. I don't believe that courage is the absence of fear. I believe what courage is, that courage is simply the ability to overcome the emotions of fear and to be able to do that which is right despite the threat to our physical well-being. And that pretty much is what we see here in the case of Jesus. Now, one of the things I think about sometimes too is a statement that people often make in modern society. In fact, it's a pretty popular statement. You hear someone say that an individual is stepping out of their comfort zone. Well, a lot of times we step out of our comfort zone. There are a lot of things that we do that really they're not in our wheelhouse, as some people might say. You know, there's an example of that in the Old Testament. Moses was called upon by the Lord to go down to the land of Egypt to demand that the people of Israel would be liberated and let go from that land. And in response to that request, if you please, from God, that command of God, Moses said unto the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore, nor since thou hast spoken to thy servant, but I am slow of speech and of a slow tongue. And the Lord said unto him, think about this. You see, you think of the difference between the person who is a non-believer and the person who is a believer. Moses comes and says, I'm not capable of this. I don't have the strength to do it. I don't have the abilities to do it. And the Lord said unto him, who hath made man's mouth? Or who maketh the dumb or deaf or seeing or the blind? Have not I the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with thy mouth, and teach thee what thou shalt say. Christians are often called upon to step outside their comfort zone. In fact, I suppose that all of us are to a certain degree. Because if you think about it, you go back and you look at the statements that's made in Galatians 5 about the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these, and that we can't be involved in those things. And Acts 3:19 says that we have to be converted, so those things have to become a thing of the past. You think about 1 Corinthians chapter 6, in which he describes numerous things that people's lifestyles there. And he said, of such were some of you, but you're washed, you're sanctified. Almost, maybe we could say everyone who becomes a Christian steps outside their comfort zone. All of a sudden, we're entering into a different relationship that's very demanding of us. And probably most of us are pretty uncomfortable with that. I mean, if you are a person who is a member of a very worldly crowd and you suddenly obey the gospel, do you think you haven't stepped outside your comfort zone the next time you see those individuals? The Apostle Paul, who obeyed the gospel, he was a rabbi in the Jewish religion, very strong and powerful man, and all of a sudden he begins to preach that the law of Moses is no longer binding. You think he didn't step outside his comfort zone? You think fear wasn't a part of their life? You think that's not something that causes a certain degree of anxiety and unsettledness and unrest in their life? I mean, a person has to understand that fear is a reality. Fear is something that exists in every person's life. And there's no way that we're going to eliminate that from our life. But what we can do is we can reach the point that we believe that God created us and that He gives us power that maybe we don't understand. He gives us abilities that maybe we don't get, but we have them. And be willing to simply accept that role as Moses was commanded of God to remember who it is that's making this request of you. And understand that I wouldn't ask you to do something that you're not capable of doing. So I think fear is something that we have to be very careful about. But I think this is true too. When you get to this point and you're dwelling on the idea of fear is something that has a great deal to do with us realizing who really has power. For example, I once went with a gentleman to pick up a tractor. Went to a trailer place that sold mobile homes. And he had loaned his tractor to the individual, went to get it back, and we went on a Saturday afternoon, and there was nobody there except for a dog, a trained guard dog, German Shepherd, very ferocious, very vicious-looking dog. He comes around the corner of one of the units when we're about to get to the tractor, and his teeth are barred, and he obviously means business. And I was terrified. This gentleman probably was too, but he took a different approach than me. I kind of froze. I don't know what I was planning on doing next, but I know what he did. He balled up his fist and knocked him in the head, and the dog just went back behind the unit, didn't come back. But every time that I would get separated from him, the dog would come toward me, and so I'd just step over close to him. That's really kind of where we are when it relates to our view of God. I want to look back in the book of Psalms, chapter 6, and there are 10 verses, and we'll read them all. It is the Psalm of David. David said to the Lord, O Lord, rebuke me not in thine anger, neither chasten me in thy hot pleasure. In other words, you have the ability to do it, but I'm requesting that you don't. Have mercy upon me, O Lord, for I am weak. O Lord, heal me, for my bones are vexed. My soul is also sore vexed, but thou, O Lord, how long? Return, O Lord, deliver my soul. O save me for thy mercy's sake. For in death there is no remembrance of thee, in the grave who shall give thee thanks? I am weary with my groaning all the night. Make I my bed to swim in tears. I water my couch with tears. Mine eye is consumed because of grief. It waxeth old because of all mine enemies. Depart from me, all you workers of iniquity, for the Lord hath heard the voice of my weeping. The Lord hath heard my supplication. The Lord will receive my prayer. Let all my enemies be ashamed and sore vexed. Let them return and be suddenly ashamed. What he's getting at is very simple. You know, I am a weak creature. I'm a human being, and I have very limited abilities. But God, on the other hand, is He who created the universe, who created me, who created all things, who set all things in motion, who set in motion the laws of nature. And that God that I serve has power that I don't have. And I think sometimes that is one of the ways that we handle fear. The Apostle Paul, when he had the thorn in the flesh in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and he besought the Lord that it would depart from him, I don't know if it was out of fear, out of dread, out of pain. I don't know what the exact emotion was that was causing him to seek that it depart from him. But I do know what the answer was, and I do know what his reaction was. The answer God gave was this: my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. And Paul then said, most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. We need to realize, you know, if we're trying to deal with fear, the real secret is we have to realize who has the power. It's interesting to me that we see people who talk as if they have power. Whether you're talking about the leader of North Korea, whether you're talking about the leader of China, or whether you're talking about the President of the United States. All of them have certain degrees of power, but their power is limited. Limited for various means and in various ways. And we need to understand that all of those people are going to be fearful also. Why? Because their power is limited. And if they have no belief in God, then that fear becomes something that's very difficult to deal with. But on the other hand, when I begin to think about all the things that people try to make me fearful of, I understand one thing. And that is, God is in control of all things. What He does, man will not control. Man cannot change some things. The Old Testament talks about a leper spots can't be changed, but it makes an exception. God could if He pleased. Man cannot. So we need to understand and we need to realize this idea of who has power. So today, when you look around about you and you see all the things that are occurring and you become very fearful and you just kind of wring in your hand, you don't know where you're going to turn, let me give you a suggestion. Turn to God. Just turn to God. You know, I want to read something in the Old Testament. It's a rather interesting story. There was a man in the book of Isaiah that we have a recorded conversation of in chapter 36. This man was not a man of God. This man was actually a military leader of what we would today call a totalitarian imperial state trying to conquer another nation. And the nation they were trying to conquer in this particular case was the nation of Judah. And this man came, and what he was doing was making fun of their faith, which is something we see done quite often today. People are making fun of our faith if you are a Christian. But it's interesting what he said, and it sounds very similar to what we hear today. I want to read verse 4 through verse 10. If I am pronouncing the man's name correctly, his name was Rabshakeh. And he said unto them, Say ye now to Hezekiah. Hezekiah was the ruler of the people of God. Thus saith the great king, the king of Assyria, What confidence is this wherein thou trustest? Sayest thou, but they are but vain words. I have counsel and strength for war. Now in whom dost thou trust, that thou rebellest against me? Now then remember, this is the king of Assyria saying, you're trusting somebody. Who are you trusting? When you look at me, look how powerful I am. He said, Lo, thou trustest in the staff of this broken reed, on Egypt. That is, you're going to turn to Egypt for help militarily. Whereupon, if a man lean, it will go into his hand and pierce it. So is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all that trust in him. He's really pretty much right. You begin to trust in man, you're trusting on a broken reed that you may or may not be able to depend upon. But he goes on to say, But if thou say to me, We trust in the Lord our God. Is it not he whose high places, whose altars Hezekiah had taken away, and said to Judah and to Jerusalem, You shall worship before this altar? Of course, he had a great misunderstanding, but his point was, this God doesn't have any power. Now, therefore, give pledges, I pray thee, to my master, the king of Assyria. And I will give unto thee 2,000 horses, that thou be able on thy part to set riders upon them. In other words, you don't even have 2,000 people. How then wilt thou turn away the face of one captain of the least of my master's servants, and put thy trust on Egypt for chariots and for horsemen? For am I now come without the Lord against this land to destroy it? The Lord said unto me, Go up against this land and destroy it. Now that's kind of interesting. If you skip down to verse 14 and verse 18, the man continues his speech and says this, Let not Hezekiah deceive you, for he shall not, that is, Hezekiah, be able to deliver you. Neither let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord, saying, The Lord will surely deliver us. This city shall not be delivered into the hand of the king of Assyria. Now that's what he said. That was the speech that he made. You know, when I was in Vietnam, I also remember a case in which we were distributing propaganda literature. We'd fly helicopters or airplanes over areas, and we would drop leaflets that had certain things written on them. They sounded somewhat like that, which you read at the head of Rabshakeh. And you also understand that the Viet Cong were doing pretty much the same thing, and the North Vietnamese and the Chinese. You know, when you look at nations sometimes, I don't know if you've ever watched any wrestling or not. I haven't in many years. But I have seen some, and I've seen some of the advertisements for them on television. Wrestlers are kind of like dogs in a dog fight. You know, if you ever watch two dogs fight, most of the time the fight doesn't materialize. They just kind of sit and ruffle their fur and growl at each other and make faces at one another, and finally one of them will just back away and go away. And that's kind of the way man is. Men are basically blowhards. They say a lot of things that may or may not be true. And that's what this man was doing. What we would call in today's world propaganda. Try to scare everybody. Try to make fear be a reality. But I want to tell you what happened. I want to tell you what happened. And the people had nothing to do with it. In 2 Kings chapter 19, when we find what actually happened here, after all this talking was done, and after all this positioning of each was done, through no fault of the Assyrian army and through no power of the Israeli army, here's what happened. It came to pass that night, 2 Kings chapter 19 and verse 35, it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out, smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh. And it came to pass, as he was worshiping the house of Nisroch, his god, that 2 men, his sons, smote him with the sword and escaped to the land of Armenia. And Esarhaddon, his son, reigned in his stead. Isn't it interesting? You look at that situation, and when it all boiled down to the final analysis, man had nothing to do with the outcome. Nothing. I mean, you look at the outcome, and here is a powerful nation come up against a relatively powerless nation, had already destroyed the northern 10 tribes, and he comes down to Judah to destroy the other 2 tribes of God's people. He rants and raves and talks about his power, tries to intimidate the people, and probably did a pretty good job from what we can read. And here is the king of the people of God who really doesn't react at all, and God intervened. You sometimes wonder why we don't learn from that. Why we don't learn how powerless we are. We are very powerless to do good. We're very powerless to do evil. In the final analysis, as the wise man would say, generations are going to come, generations are going to go. Think of all the things that you read about that have happened in the past, and I'm sure that many times people were prophesying Armageddon because of them, and the world's still there. It kind of reminds me sometimes. I saw some pictures on the news of Mount Juliet, the neighborhood in Mount Juliet, been destroyed by a tornado. And even a month later, it's still in terrible, terrible condition. Let me ask you something. If you see a news clip 100 years from now in the same area, what will it look like then? You see, Job was really pretty much right when he said, the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. And then the Lord giveth again. Blessed be the name of the Lord. The truth is that we human beings are pretty much nowhere close to what we think we are, either in power or in knowledge. And what we need to learn to do is to do the best that we can and leave the rest in the hands of God. And that's pretty much the only place that we're going to find ourselves. If you're a believer in God, you'll be able to handle difficulties. If you're not a believer in God and you're a believer in your own strength and you see the limitations of it, you may become overtaken with despair. I think it's something that we need to consider. I'm not normally one that preaches lessons always based upon current events. But I'm 73, and I've lived through quite a few things. I was born right at the end of World War II, lived through the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the several wars that we've had in the Middle East, and even the 9/11. But I tell you one thing, I've never seen people react as we have now, and sometimes I wonder if it's not because many of us have simply lost our perspective that God exists, that God's in control, and what seems to us to be a major, major obstacle looking back in history may not appear nearly so big as we thought it to be. And it's something that we sometimes need to think about. Trust in God. That's the only thing that we have that we can depend upon. Everything else is something that is like all human beings. I mean, many times I've said in preaching over the years that I sometimes hear people talk about the mortality rate from smoking, or mortality rate from drug abuse, or mortality rate from the current virus that is upon us. But let me tell you what the true mortality rate of man is. It is appointed a man once to die, and after this the judgment, Hebrews 9:27. The mortality rate for every person living today is the same for every other person. We're going to die. So this life is a place that we can prepare ourselves so that God will accept us into His protection for eternity. And that's what we really need to be concerned with. If we get too caught up with the physical, then don't lose sight of our faith of the eternal. We'll have another lesson next week, and we'll let you know at that time more concerning what our plans are for continued worship at the building and Bible studies, and hopefully we'll soon be able to get back to that. But until we do, we'll continue to address you in this way, and hopefully you'll listen in and continue to look for us each week, and certainly look forward to that opportunity.